1987.
Former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, what did you do when you were Secretary of Defense that put us in a ready position for the situation in Iraq?
Well, I like to think that all the things we did in the 7 years that I was there and was continued after I left for another year did put us in position to do this. We acquired much more airlift, for one thing. We worked out the various craft arrangements under which we could use commercial planes. We got very much more modern equipment. The tanks were finally brought to usable state during that time. The new tank, after some 20 years of development, more planes were added, more ammunition. All the things that I think we had to do, and that if we had not done, we would not have been able to do more than just urge the Iraqis to please leave Kuwait and try to pass some resolutions. I think we regained the military strength that enabled us to carry out presidential policy of firmness and not tolerating aggression.
Did you ever sit around your office or in a briefing and talk about this specific kind of an operation?
Yes, the specific kind of operation we did. I have to tell you that the aggressor was a different nation, but the idea of aggression against the oil fields, aggression in the Mideast, was one of the bases for the whole development of the Rapid Deployment Force, which had actually started under President Carter, but which we believe we brought to a situation with the transport and with the additional capabilities, with the new command we created, the Central Command, that made all of this basically possible. And it's vital to have that kind of capability. So many people now are talking about the military option and the terrible threat of war. My feeling has been right along that the more we can get over and the quicker we can build up, the more we diminish the chances that any of these troops will ever have to be used in combat. It's the fact of having them there, and making Saddam Hussein, for all of his posturing and all that, start talking about getting talks going right away, that brought that on. It diminishes the chances of war if you're ready and willing to fight.
The numbers game we see being played all the time on this situation over there, how many people in the U.S. military have to be over there in order to have a strong force in your opinion?
Well, I think we will probably work ourselves up. The American forces probably, with all the support troops, probably close to 100,000, perhaps more than that if time goes on and the economic blockade doesn't work as quickly as we hope it will.
You're talking about soldiers?
We're talking about everybody.
Fighting men, everything?
Support troops and all the rest, yes. I would suspect that we would not go too much over 100,000, but again, I'm not privy to all of the plans that the President has or the extent of it. And I think it's very hard to estimate anyway, because you size your force to the task, and the task at the moment is to do exactly what they're doing, providing a clear military option, which the more its capability increases, the less of the chances it'll have to be used. That's the paradox we were always trying to get across to Congress and the American people, that we needed this capability so that we wouldn't have to use it.
Let me ask you about the press.
Yes.
You're on the other side now.
Well, I've gone over. I was on the other side before. You've forgotten I used to edit the Harvard Crimson.
I didn't forget that, but you are now the publisher of Forbes magazine?
True, yes.
What about the press in this? You watch a lot of what's on television, read the papers. How are they doing?
Oh, I think very well. I think it's a terribly difficult story to report. A very interesting story from what it's like in Kuwait this morning in the Washington Post. Very well done story by someone who has apparently just worked his way out. You get a very, very good picture of the desolate nature of the deserted streets, the fact that the palace of the ruling family that are all in ruins now, and get an idea of the destruction that's taken place just in this short time by the Iraqi aggression. I think it's being handled very well. It's a very difficult story to report. You're spread out over a long period. You've got the naval forces at sea. You've got the naval blockade, which we hope will take effect very shortly. I hope the United Nations will pass the necessary resolutions. You've got land forces gathering strength. You've got other nations contributing, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, and perhaps even Libya. I don't quite believe it yet, but they say they might. All of these things are very hard to report. I think it's being handled very well.
You're Secretary of Defense. Let's pretend for a moment, Neil, for 7 years plus. At this stage in the game, or let's say 2 weeks ago, what would you have done about the press? Who would you have called in? Would you had a strategy session?
We have a plan, and all in operation have had ever since Grenada of a pool, and that pool is over there now. Representatives of the print media, representatives of the networks, representatives of the wire services, of the photographic groups. They would go over first. They go over first because with the limited transport and with the need to use every available airlift that we possibly have. I mean, when you transport the number of people over, I mean, the general in charge of our strategic airlift this morning was telling us that this is the equivalent of transferring a city like Jefferson City, Missouri, with all of the people, all of the automobiles, all of the supplies over, and it's been done in less than 2 weeks. When you do that, you don't have much room left. So you have a pool arrangement, and as you get more and more available space, and as you get situations in which commercial aircraft can go, then more and more of the press can come in. But initially, you have the pool arrangement so that the people can be informed, but that the huge numbers of press will not that want to go will not interfere with the actual military operation. That's the criteria. You can't let anything interfere with the mission of the troops or anything interfere with the safety of the troops. Once they are there and building up, there's other transport available, then the more press, the better.
But what's the first thing you all expect to go wrong in press relations?
That somebody will get mad because he can't get where he wants to go, and we'll write a destructive article that will start undermining public confidence here. That, however, is one of the possibilities with a free press, and we simply have to try to counter it with the facts to whatever extent we can. I haven't seen anything of that happen yet, but you're also worried that there could be, before you get the security arrangements established, that there could be some information transmitted inadvertently that might help the enemy, but the chances of that are reasonably remote now.
There are a couple of people that have criticized. One of them was Charles Kuralt, who suggested that you get more information out of Iraq than you can out of Saudi Arabia because the military has such raps on this. What would you say to him?
Well, I would say to him that I don't believe he's been in either place recently, and I think that what you get out of Iraq is what they want you to get out of Iraq. If you get anything out of Iraq that you don't want to get, that they don't want you to get out, I would doubt very much if those reporters would be around to report anything. That's the way they operate in that country. In Saudi Arabia, yes, they have had for a long time a very closed situation. The idea of suddenly changing it and having up to 100,000 foreign troops, more or less, coming into their country is a very traumatic thing for them. But I have not noticed any restraints or anything that hampered the free flow of news out of Saudi Arabia. Out of Iraq, they've been at war for 9 years, and they are a total dictatorship. And the only thing that gets out of Iraq is what the government wants to get out. That's why I think we're reading a fair amount of what could most politely be described as Iraqi propaganda coming out of Iraq now. That's what they want us to read.
Let's say there's a shooting war that goes on over there. And by the way, do you expect that to happen?
Well, I think the more we build up, the greater strength we have, the less of the chances for it. I think that as the economic noose tightens around Saddam Hussein, the chances are that he will more and more keep demanding talks and perhaps offer some ways in which he can save face or something. But I think this is one situation, one of the few situations in which an economic blockade enforced by naval blockades and by the ability to stop ships and search them and all the rest. I think this is one case where that can work, because Iraqi people import about 80% of their food. They are not a self-sufficient nation. They've only got one thing to sell and that anybody wants to buy, and that's oil. And if you can stop all the oil going out and stop everything going in, I think in a very short time Saddam Hussein's position will become intolerable. Remember, he sits at the head of a very small minority party. It's a total dictatorship, but this Ba'ath party is a very small minority, and he rules by repression. So I think if the economic noose can tighten very quickly and effectively, and I think it might because we have enormous, amazing support for it, then I think that we can get away without the war. I also think that he is, in addition to being a brutal, cruel, aggressive, ambitious man, I also think he's a realist. And I think he understands perfectly well that despite very large numbers of individuals in his military, he could not stand up to an American assault.
go back to the press for a second, and that's what I was leading up to. Did you ever study the effect of the press and on our situation in Vietnam?
Yes, to some extent, and I heard a very great deal about it after I got to the Pentagon, and I have to say that I think it was one of the things that caused a very severe drop in morale in our armed forces, which we encountered when we took over in 1981. I think it's one of the things that drove a great wedge between the American military and the American people. Because frankly, I think that while there were a tremendous number of mistakes in Vietnam, and I opposed the whole activity in Vietnam, but I think the way many of the reporters dealt with it, many of their press reports, that the American people were given the impression that there was a kind of moral equivalency over there, and that many of the press were sitting in independent judgment as to whether the U.S. or the Vietnamese were right. That was in total contrast to the way the press operated in World War II. I don't think that the press should be a propaganda machine for the American military, but on the other hand, I don't think that there should have been quite such a steady stream of bitter, continuous criticisms of the American military in Vietnam. The policy of whether they should be there or not is a totally different matter. But you know, when those troops started coming home, our troops from Vietnam, I saw them picketed, booed, and hissed on the streets and ports of San Francisco. And that, to my mind, was one of the lowest periods in American history. And I have to say that I think part of this stemmed from essentially the almost insistence of reporting with tremendous emphasis. And a lot of reporting is simply, as you know, selecting events and emphasizing them, with tremendous emphasis on all of the things that were viewed as having gone wrong. Again, it's very hard to draw the line between this and simply asking that the press be a propaganda machine, which no one should do and which no one wants. But the military emerged from Vietnam with the feeling that the press, the American press, was against them. That totally unlike World War II, the American press had been on the side of the Vietnamese. And while this is probably not a fair assessment, it was a perception that pervaded most of the military. And it took a very long time to try to redress that balance. And that's one of the great things President Reagan did, was to restore the confidence of the American people in our military. And the military responded. The volunteer program was working magnificently now. People in 1981 were leaving in droves. Now you have waiting lists. And I think that's the kind of relationship the American people want to have with their military.
So how do you change things from what it was in Vietnam to what it would be today if something happened like this?
Well, I don't. You're certainly not going to tell the reporters how they can write their stories or anything of that kind.
You let them go out on missions like they could in Vietnam?
Oh yes, I think they should. Whenever it's will not interfere with a military operation, I think the press should be where they want to be. But you do have a situation sometimes. We had it in Grenada, where we had to go in very, very quickly with very complete surprise, where you can't get the press in at once. But thereafter they came in, day 3 I think it was, and I don't have any problem with their going anywhere. I just would hope that on our own, our press would want to report responsibly on what's happening and give a fair picture. And if they have opposition in their own personal views to our being where we are, I'd like to see that separated from their reports of the conduct of the troops.
A lot of people, though, in the media are still suspicious that the reason why they couldn't get into Grenada for 3 days was because you didn't want them in there on the first and second wave.
Well, didn't question whether we wanted them or not. When you have to do an operation of that size, and it was a big operation, there were 2, 3, almost, well, 2.5 divisions reinforced and expanded. When you have that, you have to move very quickly. And when you have to do it on 48 hours notice, without the pre-landing intelligence that we would normally like to have had, or reconnaissance, then you do have to use every single bit of space that you have for troops and supplies. And we did that. But there was never any intention to keep anybody out. We also relied on the recommendations of the commanders on the spot. I've always felt that if you entrust the generals and admirals with the conduct of an operation of that kind, which you should do, that you should follow their recommendations. And their recommendation was that, at least for the first 2 days, we don't have any possibility of getting press in with any degree of safety for the operation, the security of the operation. But after 2 days, they went and went everywhere and did all kinds of reporting, including some very wrong stories. But they were perfectly free to do that.
So what are the lessons then from Vietnam, and how have you changed? How did you change the whole press operations to avoid the kind of thing that happened?
I think one of the first lessons from Vietnam is that you should not go into any military operation unless it's important enough to the United States' interest to win it. If you go in half-heartedly, if you go in without the intention of winning, which was one of the great crimes that we committed in Vietnam. When you ask men to commit their lives, men and women, to go over and commit their lives in a military operation, and you do not intend to win, you do not intend to support them sufficiently to win as completely, as quickly as you can, then you're going to have a very divided country at the very least, and you're going to have a great many people who don't understand why they're there. And indeed, it's hard to explain to anybody why they're there if they're not there to win a war. That is the first thing you do, and that's been done, I think, completely in this situation. It was done in Grenada, because there you had 1,000 American students who were in real peril of their lives, and who, when they were rescued, not only bent down to kiss the soil of the United States when they got back, but came down, hundreds of them, to tell the president how grateful they were that he had done what he had done. And this belied all of the stories that were coming out that they really weren't in any peril at all. I think you have to have that kind of situation first. Then I think you have to try to get the press in as quickly as you can and give them all the freedom you can consistent with the security and safety of the troops. And then I think you have to rely on their individual good sense and good judgment to report what they're seeing. You can't tell them what to write. Nobody wants to do that.
The atmosphere in Washington is that a lot of the cabinet's on vacation. 535 members of Congress, most of them are out of this town. They're on vacation or out with their constituency. The Supreme Court's on vacation. If all those folks were in town, would this whole thing be different right now?
I'm afraid it might be, yes.
How?
Well, I think that you would have, certainly I don't know, the members of the cabinet who are necessary and part of the Security Council all seem to be here. They're meeting every day. And the president is fully informed every half hour, every 20 minutes, every 5 minutes probably, of anything that's happening. As far as Congress is concerned, they're informed through briefings to the leadership and all of that. So I don't know whether it would be significantly different if they were all done. There'd be significantly more public statements issued, I'm sure.
What about the Congress and hearings and things like that? Do they help or hurt?
Well, there's a good time for them. It's not a particularly good time when you're trying to move 50 to 100,000 troops over as quickly as you can, and knowing that until you have built up the necessary supplies and have them in the necessary position to protect themselves, it's not particularly good to have your energies diverted by hearings, but certainly hearings are an entirely proper part of our process. And I have no doubt whatever that they will start very soon.
What about the theory that if they'd all been in town, the president wouldn't have been able to get as many troops over there as he's getting over there, and that's the reason why he's moving so quickly? No,
I don't think so. I don't think there's any way the Congress could have or would have tried to stop it. The president's action, the action of the executive in the conduct of foreign policy, is, as Jefferson said, supreme and exclusive. There have been a lot of attempts. The War Powers Resolution is one of the silliest and most dangerous attempts to try to stop this kind of thing. And that is still basically at this point a small cloud hanging over the operation. You know, if the Congress decides that it is a situation for the War Powers Act to apply, and they so vote, or even if they don't vote, if there is not an affirmative vote allowing the troops to stay, they can be required to come home after 60 or at the outside 90 days, no matter what the situation is, and even if they're engaged in combat. It's a resolution that could have only been put together by people who didn't have the faintest idea of the realities of military operations.
Would you settle this issue that we keep hearing about all the time, and it depends on who's sitting in your chair there, is whether or not we get one view or the other, and that is, did the United States support Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we tried to stay neutral. Henry Kissinger's famous statement sums it up, I think, as well as everybody felt. He said it's too bad both sides couldn't lose. But we tried to stay basically neutral, but I think there was no doubt that on certain aspects of it, we did try to help Iraq, because Iraq was fighting a war against a country that was an implacable enemy of the United States, that always referred to us as the Great Satan, had behaved in an absolutely reprehensible fashion with our hostages over there for over 400 days. so that it was hard to feel completely neutral between those two countries. The greatest service we did to Iraq was to demonstrate by responding to the Kuwaitis' call for help in escorting their oil tankers through the Gulf, that we convinced the Iranians they couldn't possibly win. They sent their navy out 2 or 3 times, and it was utterly defeated and smashed. And when that happened the 3rd time, and there was nothing left, then the Iranians, as the Ayatollah Khomeini said, he said, we've decided to swallow the bitter poisoned cup of defeat. And that's what helped the Iraqis, it helped the Kuwaitis, it helped everybody. But during all that time, the Kuwaitis and the Saudis were pouring billions into Iraq to help them. And as they say, no kind deed goes unpunished.
Have you ever been to Iraq?
No, I've not been to Iraq. I've been to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait many times, and Oman and Bahrain and the Emirates and various places like that. I've not been in Iraq.
Are you surprised that the Saudis and obviously the Kuwaitis, but the folks in Oman and Abu Dhabi are letting us come there and letting us put troops on their soil?
I'm surprised and delighted, because it seems to me that this is a full recognition of the fact that we do work together with them. They need us and we need them, and it's a recognition of how vital it is that they be helped in this way. These are very proud societies. They're people who do not like to invite outsiders in, or although they're very hospitable people and very kind people, but they also have a very strong feeling against anything that breaks their basic isolation. And for them to agree and to invite in literally hundreds of thousands of outside troops to work with them and help them in the defense of their land is, I think, a very realistic but a most welcome approach. I think it portends a great deal of good for the future, in the sense of being able to settle, I hope finally, some of these terrible disputes that keeps the Mideast such a permanent tinderbox.
If we're going to strike it all over there first, when would we do it?
Oh, I wouldn't get into any hypotheticals of that kind at all. And I think, as I say, my great hope is that as we build up, as we add and transfer the immense strength that we gained in the 80s to that region, each day it makes it less likely that military combat is actually required. If Saddam Hussein should strike out blindly and feel himself really tightened, this noose tightening around him, we are fully prepared to take care of that, I think, without the slightest question. But my hope is that with the economic blockade, I hope, being made effective by the United Nations today, the actual use of combat troops of any of the many nations that are assembling there will be unnecessary. And bear in mind, you've got Syrian troops, you've got Egyptian troops, Moroccan troops, American troops, you've got British forces, you've got Canadian, Australian. There is no one yet in the world now who is really supporting Iraq. Even Yemen said that they are going to enforce the blockade if the United Nations votes it.
After the dust clears on this, will we be friends with Iran and Syria and countries like that?
Well, it depends on the leadership. It depends on whether or not they want it. Iran has never demonstrated, since the Shah left, unfortunately, they've never demonstrated the slightest desire to do anything but attack us and behave in the most outrageous, uncivilized, brutal manner possible. And if they're going to continue to do that, then it's very difficult to maintain a friendship.
You, again, for the moment, you're in your former job, Secretary of Defense. Are you sitting over there saying, this is going to help us keep this budget high at the Pentagon?
Oh, no. No, that is absolute nonsense.
Doesn't happen?
No, it certainly doesn't happen. My own feeling has been, and I've written many articles about it, made too many speeches about it, that the Congress has been behaving in an outrageously irresponsible fashion in making the cuts that they have made in every budget that President Bush has submitted. And even President Reagan's last defense budgets were just slashed in a most irresponsible way. And I'm delighted that something will perhaps restore some sense to the Congress in restoring some of those cuts and reversing that position. But this is, nobody's over there chortling about how much we have to spend. Nobody likes to do that at all. Nobody wants to spend that kind of money. But you have to ask yourself, really, what is the mission of the United States, and what is our goal? What are our needs? Do we want to balance the budget, or do we want to maintain peace and freedom?
It will change, though, won't it? The way the Congress and the President and the public looks at military spending.
Well, I hope that they'll realize now, all of the people in Congress, certainly the President's realized it right along, I hope they'll realize that threats can come from many sources and many directions, and that each one of them can pose the possibility that we can lose our peace and our freedom, which is the most important thing. Peace without freedom is not worth very much. Even the Soviets could be taken over by a pro-Stalinist kind of regime, and the immense military forces which they have not dismantled could be used in a way we wouldn't like. At the moment, that doesn't seem possible, and we're delighted. But that could change overnight. You need to have, if you value your peace and freedom, if you really want to keep it, you have to be willing to fight for it, and you have to be capable of fighting for it. And that's what Congress was really destroying, was our capability by these blind and deep cuts that didn't seem to have any connection with military capability at all. Were based only on whether or not we had a tidier balance sheet.
At what point do you have to go back to a draft?
I hope you won't have to. The volunteer program is working extraordinarily well, and my understanding is that the lines at the recruiting depots are still as long. There are a lot of people who want to get in. There were a lot of people who were being put out of the military because of the cuts who wanted to stay in. And I don't, at this point, I'm, again, not privy to any of the inside information anymore, but I would be very, I don't think a draft will be necessary, not for a long time.
In a situation like this, does anybody over at the Pentagon pick up the phone and call you and say, hey, do you remember that thing we worked on 5 years ago?
Oh, from time to time, but it's mostly just a chat. They're doing very well. They don't need any help.
Do you have any rights as former Secretary of Defense to see information at all?
No. Well, I was in various intelligence posts after I left and have various clearances and all of that kind of thing, but everybody's very busy. They don't need to brief X's.
What about weapon systems? As a result of this crisis, any of the weapon systems that we're getting less money going to pick up, do you think? SDI?
Well, I certainly hope
B2?
SDI will, yes. Not necessarily related to this crisis, although I think it's a good thing for every purpose. I think it's an absolutely essential thing that we have a defense. Very few people realize we don't have any defense against intercontinental or intermediate range missiles, and SDI will give us that, and it needs to be funded. And if it is funded, we can realize the great hope and promise and dream of the President Reagan, for this. And President Bush is strongly for it and has supported it very strongly. The bombers, the B-2 bomber has a number of roles that could be played in this situation, just as the stealth fighters are over there now. And the tanks will be most useful. Tanks that were derided by many people when they first came online, but which managed to win every NATO competition there is, and are regarded by the men who drive them as the best in the world. So all of these things are necessary. They're expensive. They're unattractive to people in democracies. We don't like to talk about these things, or we don't like the necessity of them. But if we want to stay a democracy, we have to have them.
What are you going to be watching closely as the developments unfold over there, as to the decisions you made when you were Secretary of Defense? What works and doesn't work? Are you anxious to see? Well, already you've seen some of the results. Are you? What hasn't worked and that you prepared for?
Well, I have to be frank and say that I haven't really seen anything yet that hasn't worked. I don't, as I say, I don't have all the information, of course, that we used to have or anything like it. But as far as we can tell, first of all, the troop movement seems to have been handled with exemplary speed and efficiency. The plans are there and in place and being followed. And you aren't having any of the, that I can see, any of the tremendous confusion that accompanies this. But when you move 40, 50, 60, 70,000 troops over very quickly, and all their equipment, without any kind of knowledge that that was going to happen, except since August 4th, I guess it was, August 5th, and you have the result that we're having, I have to be very proud and very pleased with the way things are going. I think they went beautifully in Panama. I think General Powell is one of the finest officers we have, and working together with Dick Cheney, I think a great result is being produced at a time when we most need it.
About out of time, you mentioned before we started you're heading to Maine for 10 days. The reason I bring that up is that Jim Baker's on vacation in Wyoming, the President's on vacation up at Kennebunkport. From your experience as Secretary of Defense, do you think the American people are split on this issue? Should they be on vacation?
I don't have any idea how the American people feel about it. I think it's important for presidents to get out of the atmosphere that necessarily is in Washington 12 months a year, 24 hours a day. But I don't think there's any slight question about his ability to keep in full touch. The communications networks that we have and the command and control facilities are excellent, and they are working. And the President can be informed and can make decisions, and his decisions can be transmitted just as quickly there.